Welcome back to the Coming Clean podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Perkins, and we've got a great show for you today. What we often talk about at ACC is the need for pragmatic leadership on climate, energy, and the environment. And today we're talking with someone who is running for the U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania to be a pragmatic leader on those issues. So we talk about everything from energy independence to conservation to solutions that we can use to solve climate change. Today, I'm interviewing Dave McCormick. As I mentioned, he is a candidate for Senate in Pennsylvania. Please enjoy this episode.
Welcome to Coming Clean, the podcast dedicated to common sense environmental dialogue, environmental optimism, and real environmental solutions. This show is proudly powered by Ørsted.
Dave McCormick, thanks so much for coming on the show. How are you?
I'm great, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So you are a candidate for U.S. Senate up in Pennsylvania. Of course, the last Senate campaign that was run up there received a lot of attention. But let's introduce people to you. We have people who listen to this who are both engaged in politics, but also many who don't really pay much attention. So let's talk about you and your background and why you've decided to run for Senate.
Well, thank you. I'm a seventh generation Pennsylvanian, so I was born in Western Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, and I grew up in Bloomsburg, which is outside of Scranton. And my mom and dad were teachers, and I grew up in a quintessential Pennsylvania small town. My folks worked at my dad worked at the university there, but we had a farm. And so I grew up baling hay and trimming Christmas trees, and was a bus boy and a paper boy. Hunted, played sports, football and wrestling, and wrestling got me to West Point. And I wasn't a great student, but I was a decent student, and I ended up wrestling at West Point for 4 years. Wrestling is a big sport in the state of Pennsylvania, and I was the co-captain of the team at Army, and then had a military career. I served in the 82nd Airborne Division. I was a Ranger. I went to Iraq as part of the Gulf War. And then a businessman back in Pennsylvania. I came back, kept our family farm, and I came back and I ran a technology company in Pittsburgh, which we took public and became a big success story. And then went back to public service in the government, and then came back and ran a big investment firm. So I've been all over the place. I've lived most of my life in Pennsylvania, but I've served in the public sector and the military, and also in business for most of my career. And the reason jumped into the Senate race in 2022 is the same reason I'm back in the race now, which I believe the country's in trouble and needs new leadership, and the Senate seat in Pennsylvania would be an important way to serve. And I feel blessed by everything America has to offer, blessed by the American dream. I feel like my life's been better than I would have ever hoped, and an obligation to give back. Sort of the duty, honor, country motto of West Point looms large in my mind, and it's why I'm running.
Well, that sort of answers my second question, which is, with everything going on politically, especially on the national front, why in the world would you want to, run and join a dysfunctional family in the Senate? But I mean, how do you view the dysfunction that's happening in Washington, and what are the kinds of things that you hope to accomplish to, aid us out of the time that we're in?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, because I ran in 2022 and I lost the primary, which, as you said, was a very high profile primary. I lost to Mehmet Oz by 900 votes of 1.5 million votes cast. So my first foray into politics didn't end the way I'd hoped. And this past summer, my wife and I, we have 6 daughters between us. We're very blessed. They're 23 to 17. And we talked to them. We talked among ourselves. We prayed about it, and we decided not to do it, because it's just, as you say, it's so brutal and nasty and so all consuming. And we're at the point in our lives where we're almost empty nesters and have a lot of freedom. But I just kept getting drawn back to, this is the moment. And when the country is struggling, when it's as dysfunctional as it is, and I agree with your description, that's the moment you can either throw up your hands and say it's just it's too complex, it's too far gone, or you can jump in there and try to make a difference and get into the arena. And that's why I decided to do it. And the motivation here is for most Pennsylvanians, this isn't a Republican or Democratic thing, but for most Pennsylvanians, the country's not working for them. It's not, the economy. For them, the prices are going up, their wages are going up less uh, less quickly, so they're getting squeezed. 60% of Pennsylvanians live paycheck to paycheck. The border crisis is really a big deal for Pennsylvania because of fentanyl. And so we lost 4,000 Pennsylvanians last year from fentanyl. It's a terrible crisis in small towns like mine, Bloomsburg, but also in the suburbs and in the cities. And crime in the cities, particularly Pittsburgh, where I live now, is just it's on the rise, and we can't hire enough police to solve it. And then finally, energy, which I know we'll talk about, is the great salvation for Pennsylvania. We're blessed with great assets, great reserves of natural gas, and are struggling to take advantage of that great energy opportunity because of too much regulation, and in my opinion, too much government regulation that really is standing in the way of economic growth, but also protecting our environment. So those are the kinds of issues I think I can make a difference on. I think my experience as a business leader, as a military leader, as someone who understands how the government works because I worked in the White House, I think I can make a big difference. And so that's why I'm running.
For sure. And definitely want to talk about some of those energy issues because I'm in Texas. And so much like Pennsylvania, big energy state, especially with natural gas. And so I think there's a lot we can pick out of that. Before we get into the sort of meat of those issues, I want to ask you why you care about the issue of the environment and conservation. And as a conservative, what are your thoughts about how the GOP has historically engaged on those issues?
Well, I grew up as I said, we had a family farm. It was a small farm when I was growing up, but we've added to it. So it's a large farm now with about 300 tillable acres, and another 300 are mostly woods and pasture. And so I grew up with, my dad and I talking about, we didn't farm the land, but we had a farmer, crop rotation, and thinking about how to grow, plant and grow new trees and keeping the environment and the natural beauty. And I'm a sportsman, so I hunt and I fish. I love our national parks. I grew up taking my kids to our national parks. So I've got a deep love for the environment, an absolute commitment to conservation. And, conservation is sort of at the core of what it means to be a conservative. And I think the way that the left, frankly, has portrayed a trade-off between economic growth and development and environmental cleanliness and environmental conservation and environmental protection is a false trade-off. I don't think those two goals need to be at cross purposes, and so I think unfortunately the Republican Party has often been painted that way, and in some ways because of its own a bad presentation of ideas or even bad ideas. And so I feel strongly about that. I encountered this first really working in the Bush administration. I was in the White House as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Economic Affairs, and so I was the President's Sherpa. It was called. I would go and negotiate on behalf of the government for these big summits on behalf of the president. And one of the big issues at the time in 2007 was climate change and
Okay.
the Highland Dam Summit, which was Chancellor Merkel, and a big focus was her and Prime Minister Blair pushing for the United States to pushing President Bush to acknowledge climate change and human activity is participation in that. And so I was in the middle of those negotiations, and and it was one of those things where there really was an orientation to a false trade-off, and ultimately President Bush, in my opinion at least, handled the issue, and I was part of this, where we said climate change is an issue. We need to deal with it. Human activity certainly part of it, but we need to do that in a way that deals with the real problem where emissions are coming from, and doing it in a way that protects economic growth and dynamism, and really begin to lay the groundwork for saying this is a false trade-off. We don't always get credit for that as Republicans, but that's what I think the reality is, and that's the kind of senator I'd want to be, someone who's pushing for economic growth and national security that comes with energy, being an energy superpower, but also a strong commitment to preserving and conserving our environment.
For sure. And it's about a pragmatic approach, right? It's about saying, look, we have more than a few years before we all, the world explodes, but also this is something that we do need to handle. And we can do it through innovation. We can do it through natural climate solutions. We can do it through energy independence, all of those things. And as someone, myself, who's been engaged in conservative politics since I was 13 years old, being able to see the messaging opportunity, and at times seeing a GOP that has, in my mind, there's no other issue that we cede ground to the left on. If the left has their idea of what taxation should look like, Republicans have never been the type to say, well, we're going to retreat from that and we're not going to touch that. But climate and energy and conservation seems to be one of those things that's harder to get effective communications on. I also think there are many different angles that conservatives can and do take on the environment. And I want to get your thoughts on which you feel are the most effective. So we have energy independence, we have competition with China and with Russia, there's cutting red tape through permitting reform, there's conservation and sort of that outdoors angle. Of those and what you're seeing in your race, what do you feel like American voters resonate more with, and which of those gets them on the side of conservatives?
Well, I think what's happening in real time here is a representation of what you just said about, because Republicans haven't necessarily been able to define the issue in the right way. The Democrats have sort of adopted what they think is this high ground on the environment as the long pole in the tent, the thing that we have to protect. And I think the result has been really misguided policy, which essentially has been a focused effort to eliminate the use of fossil fuels, adopt alternative energy sources with huge subsidies. And it's, in the great irony of things, it's undermined our national security. It's certainly had huge effect on our economic growth and development and jobs in places like Pennsylvania and Texas, where you're from. And ironically, it's done great damage to the environment, because by stopping the export of natural gas, or slowing the export of natural gas from what it might be to places around the world like China and India, which would replace coal-fired plants, we've actually done great damage to our global goal of reducing carbon emissions. So how do I talk about it? I talk about it in terms of those three pieces. I talk about being an energy superpower. And being an energy superpower for America and for Pennsylvania means being a significant exporter, particularly of natural gas. With that comes the economic growth and opportunity that really unlocks the potential of Pennsylvania, but we can't do that without permitting reform and reducing the red tape and the ridiculous legal hurdles that are required to actually produce natural gas and other sources of energy. And doing that in a way that recognizes that by using natural gas as a primary energy source, we're able to help the environment. And the other point I say is I'm in favor of all energy sources. What I'm not in favor of is economic subsidies that so distort the market, that are inflationary. That's really what conservatives and people that believe in free enterprise should largely be opposed to. And I think the case here is really strong. I'll make one final point, if I might, which is that the other great irony, and I think a strategic miscalculation that will become even more apparent with time, is that in its quest to really rewire the economy in favor of electric vehicles and solar and wind and so forth, the Biden administration has made us enormously dependent on China for lithium batteries, for solar panels. So we've undermined our security, both in terms of not helping our allies with natural gas. We see what happened in Europe and Ukraine when Russia was the dominant energy producer, but also by making ourselves more dependent on China.
And I'm really glad you brought up the point about China. And my next question, I think, feeds well into your background through international affairs. Um, for me, China is such a power in the global market now, and I think a lot of candidates and a lot of elected officials talk about the need to compete with China, and we need to compete with China and outdo their influence, especially at a lot of developing countries that they have made significant investment in. The question that comes up from a lot of people is often, how do we realistically compete with China? And I want to get your take on that. How do we realistically do that? And what I see is a real sprint, because this isn't a long-term game that we get to play. This is happening within the next half a decade to a decade.
Yeah, listen, here's the irony, and I'm going to say two things that may seem contradictory, but they're not. The first is that if I was going to bet in the medium to long term on who's going to out innovate, who's going to outgrow, what form of economic model is going to drive innovation in this ever changing world, I would take America 10 times out of 10 over China. And we see what's happening in China's economy with all the government ownership, the government intervention, the enormous subsidies, the state-owned enterprises. They've got a tough hand to play, and ours is a much more attractive model over time than it's proven to be. But in the near term, as you say, China has made a concerted effort with a lot of success at becoming dominant in some of the most important technology to the future of the world and to the future of our competition with China. And they've done that through an enormous amount of investment and control that they're able to exercise. And it's been very purposeful. President Xi, in his 5-year plans and 10-year plans, if you go back 10 years ago, you can see he identified 25 key technologies, everything from artificial intelligence to quantum science to robotics to composites, and wanted to ensure China was the leader in all those. So the goal was to be a techno-authoritarian regime that really replaces America. And we got to deal with that. And I think we're underinvesting in basic R&D. We need to ensure that the government and the private sector is partnering in ways that ensure free market principles dominate to not lose leadership in some of these most critical technologies. Let me give you a quick example, 5G. 5G was a case where Huawei was replacing American providers in telecom infrastructure in many countries around the world. That's a big deal because we lose a lot of influence and we're cut out of those relationships with those partners. If we're not investing and maintaining that innovative edge as a country, we're going to lose our superpower status, and that would be a real risk to America, but also to the world.
Yeah, an example of that happening in Africa, where the U.S. made an announcement that we would be investing in some of that telecoms infrastructure in Africa, trying to subvert Chinese influence. So that's definitely an area that we've got to pay attention to. Talking more about Pennsylvania and its energy sector producing a lot of natural gas, like I said, similar to Texas in that it plays a big role in American energy independence, which also plays a role in emissions reduction. As America becomes more energy independent, our emissions go down, and we lead the world in that we can export that emissions reducing technology, if you want to call it that. But one of the things that comes up, and certainly happy to get your thoughts on energy independence and the mission there. But the other thing that comes up in those discussions is how we work with the fossil fuel industries, and specifically the workers in those industries, to make them part of the environmental solution rather than shunning them, rather than saying, well, you're just going to have to go find a new job, and some of that sort of crass treatment that often happens during transitions. What are your thoughts about involving that industry to be part of the solution there?
I couldn't agree more. I don't think these are not problems or issues or questions where the government and business or workers or the workforce should be adversaries. We, I think, share a common goal of continuing to have a dynamic energy sector in a way that's reflecting the ever-changing environmental realities. And so in Pennsylvania, we have a great example of a terrific leader on that front, who's Toby Rice, who has been a real voice for how we integrate all these considerations, environmental, national security, and economic, into an energy policy that's good for workers at EQT, his company, but also good for America. And one of the things that I've noticed, I've visited a number of natural gas fracking sites in Pennsylvania, and one of the things that I ask when I'm on these rigs, I'll say to the people I'm working with, tell me about stuff, where you're from, where'd you grow up? And most of the time they're from Oklahoma or Texas.
Mm.
They're not from Pennsylvania, which is a real problem
Yeah.
because we don't have adequate training facilities. We don't have adequate partnerships between the companies and our community colleges or our four-year colleges to train young workers with the skills necessary to be able to participate in what should be a dynamic, rapidly growing industry where they make great livings and have great opportunity for terrific careers. So I think at the core of this has to be training, skills training, an alignment of incentives, private-public partnerships that ensure there's a workforce that continues to evolve to meet the needs of a rapidly changing and dynamic and exciting energy sector.
And I think that answer makes sense given your background. And I want to talk a little more about your background, both in your economic background, national security background. You mentioned you served in the military. Thank you for your service with that. You also served under President Bush as Undersecretary for Commerce for Industry, and then the Deputy Security Advisor for International Economic Affairs. We often talk about addressing energy independence as a national security opportunity, and that when America becomes energy independent and when we become an exporter of cleaner forms of energy, that makes the world safer. What is your position on the connection between those two things, good energy policy and how it affects national security?
Oh, yeah, the connection is so clear to me because I experienced it firsthand. The Gulf War began in 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded the oil fields of Kuwait, which created a bit of a crunch on the global energy sector. But the real risk was that he would keep going from Kuwait into the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, which was far and away the number one producer, I think at the time, 11 million barrels a day or something like that. I don't know what the number is today. And that would truly create an economic and energy crisis of unprecedented proportions if Saddam Hussein were to take over those oil fields. And so my unit, I was in the 82nd Airborne Division. I was out in a training mission in Arkansas, and I got a radio call in the middle of the night in early August of 1990, and my unit got on airplanes, flew back to Fort Bragg, loaded the airplanes again with new vehicles, ammunition, and flew to Saudi Arabia. And for months, my unit was on the border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq with light infantry. We didn't have tanks or anything, but it was meant to be the speed bump. If Saddam Hussein came across the border from Kuwait into Saudi Arabia, he would be declaring war against the United States of America. And that holding operation was to arouse the broader forces to come in, which ultimately resulted in the Gulf War, Desert Storm, which we won decisively. The reason I go through that story is the world's changed dramatically since then, but it shows a lesson of geopolitics and a lesson that we saw recently with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is the countries that are energy dominant, that play a significant role in powering the world, have disproportionate geopolitical strength. And so we don't want that geopolitical strength in the hands of others who would wish to do us harm, because their ability to influence global affairs in a way that might be counter to U.S. interest or come directly at the United States in ways that would be very disadvantageous to our economy or our security is really profound. And the irony here is that America's blessed. Some countries don't have the blessings that America has. We're blessed with incredible natural resources and the ability to be an energy superpower, to be energy dominant. We just have to have the wisdom to access those assets in ways that helps our economy, helps our security, but as we're talking about, helps our environment.
And a government that stays out of its own way in those endeavors too, I imagine as well.
Exactly.
One of the things that I've got to ask you, and then we'll go into some rapid fire final questions. The one energy source we haven't really touched on is nuclear. And at ACC, we are such big fans of nuclear, probably in too nerdy of a way. But nuclear is resurging. We just saw this week in Michigan a reinvestment in the nuclear facility there, keeping that on through 2051, I believe it was. Obviously, an older form of nuclear technology. Here in Texas, Governor Abbott has just embraced these small modular nuclear reactors that he's hoping to add, a decent amount to our energy mix over the next couple of decades. How do you think about nuclear, and do you see this as a place where the U.S. needs to invest more? Going back to your point about R&D, I mean, there have been so many innovations just in the past decade around nuclear technology. Give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because I wish I would have talked about it. So I think it's a huge part of our energy future. And we have a number of nuclear installations in Pennsylvania today. We have 3 Mile Island, of course, which is the reason many resist the nuclear development going forward. And what's happened since the 3 Mile Island accident in terms of the size of these reactors, the safety associated with them, the quality of the technology is enormous. And we've got 2 case studies right in front of us. We have France, which has made itself largely energy independent. It doesn't have the natural resources we do, but because of its commitment to nuclear, it's an energy powerhouse and has been wildly successful with that. And we have Germany, which Chancellor Merkel, who I mentioned, was part of that discussion then. She had embraced the idea of ridding Germany of its dependence on nuclear, and now they're dependent on, or have been dependent on, Russia for natural gas. So I couldn't think of a better way to achieve the goals of security, economic growth, and environmental protection, environment conservation by embracing nuclear. I think it's absolutely a necessity. It's part of that mix. We should not only have the basic R&D. I mean, Pittsburgh's the home of Westinghouse. Westinghouse used to be one of the great producers of nuclear reactors, and we need to also reform our regulatory framework to allow nuclear to become a potent part of our energy future. And so I'd be long on investing in basic R&D, long on investing in regulatory reform, long on bringing the private sector into the fold in a way that they have confidence. And if they have a regulatory certainty and support, they will have the confidence to invest additional capital. And I think that would be great for America and great for the world.
Well, that's awesome to hear that you embrace that. The Senate just recently passed the ADVANCE Act, which would invest more in nuclear and sort of deregulate some of that. The House passed their version, so there's definitely movement in Congress for nuclear energy, and certainly hope you can be a part of future advancements as well. Let's go into some rapid fire questions as we finish out, if that's okay with you. The first, which I think you touched on this a little bit, but I always like asking people, what is the why? What is the primary motivation that motivates you to do what you're doing? Both, your private sector career and now your campaign for the U.S. Senate.
Well, at the highest level, service to others. West Point's motto is duty, honor, country, and while that's certainly most applicable probably to the military and maybe public service, it's the kind of mantra that I try to take into private sector too. Servant leadership. It's the idea that leaders are focused on the mission and others. They're not focused on themselves. And so trying to be a leader across all those things, military, private sector, and government, in a way that is leadership for the benefit of others, for the benefit of the organization, for the benefit of the community. I think that's what motivates me, and it probably comes from my mom and dad, who are both teachers, and so I grew up with that ethic of service.
Awesome. Now, you mentioned earlier you would, take your kids to national parks, and you love national parks. What's your favorite place in nature?
Well, as I said, we toured the national parks with our kids in the early days, and I love nature across America, but the nature in Pennsylvania is unique and special. And so we've got incredible parks. I grew up near Ricketts Glen, where I hiked many times as a kid, and we have our family farm. And the family farm has now enough woods on it that one of my favorite things to do is to just hike around our farm and see the beautiful views over the rolling farm fields, the rolling corn. And I've learned with time that I like to spend time in places that I know best. And I know Pennsylvania the best, and I certainly know our area where I grew up the best. And that's the nature I appreciate the most.
Beautiful states for sure. A book recommendation. This could be something that a classic that you've read a while ago that you think everyone should read, or maybe something new and interesting that you read recently. But do you have a book recommendation for our audience?
I really do. And when people ask, I've recommended this to a number of people over recent years. It's a relatively recent book. It's called The Splendid and the Vile,
Yeah.
and it's by Erik Larson, and it's about Winston Churchill in the 2 years between when Germany uh, invaded France and UK was brought into the war, and America entered the war a couple years later. And it's a leadership book drawn from conversations that he had on the weekends at Chartwell, and a diary his wife did, but his daughter did, rather. But the most important thing about the book, it's the best example of leadership in my mind, where he did two things at the same time, which are very hard to do. And our current moment in America, I think, requires some of this leadership. He tells the British people exactly how bad it is. He doesn't pull any punches. He lets them know how profound the challenges are with the Germans, and that they may lose their great country.
Yeah.
And yet he speaks with a sense of optimism and and inspiration, where he's both giving him the hard love, the tough love, this is how bad it is, and the inspiration to prevail and call upon their best angels. And it really jumped out at me when I read this book that, man, this kind of leadership is probably the hardest to get, where you can do both of those things at the same time, and it's what's required in moments of crisis. And we're in one, so it's an inspiration to me for that reason too.
That's a great recommendation. I love Churchill, and to your point, great leadership lessons throughout his life. Also, just a really like interesting guy. He probably should have died much younger in his life, but he stuck out. Like, he was maybe built a little different. I don't know. But my final question, and then we'll ask if you have any final words that you want to say to the audience before we wrap up. But what are you most looking forward to right now?
Believe it or not, I mean, I obviously look forward to winning the Senate seat and being able to go forward and serve. But I actually love the campaigning, which this is my second time at it. I think I'm much more comfortable, and I've sort of been through this once before. But campaigning, if you look at campaigning, is an opportunity every day to sort of get acquainted with lots of stories of interesting people doing interesting things, and you really get connected to the people on the campaign trail. And they're from all walks of life, all colors, religions, levels of socioeconomic achievement, veterans, non-veterans, immigrants, non-immigrants. It's a wonderful kaleidoscope. You get to see America up close and personal. You get to see Pennsylvania up close and personal. And so I've come to view that as my favorite part of this whole political journey. And the thing I'm most excited about too is I think one campaigns how they're going to govern. And so the approach I'm taking to campaigning, every little community, I've got a campaign bus. I'm spending time across all of our Commonwealth. That's the same way I'll represent the people of Pennsylvania as a senator. And so if you like people, and you like to hear those stories, and you like to really get acquainted with everything that's going on in their lives, the good, the bad, the ugly. It's a great inspiration, and I really look forward to that.
That's awesome. And then we'll just end here with giving you the floor and saying, is there anything else that you would like to say to our audience that you didn't get a chance to yet?
Well, I think thank you for the interview and the opportunity. That the topic we're discussing here is obviously of enormous importance to our country. How do we achieve the kind of energy independence, energy dominance, energy superpower that would be so good for America? But how do we do that in a way that achieves all our aims, including protecting and conserving the environment? And that, if that's an issue nationally, it feels like it's at the core of Pennsylvania's future. So Pennsylvania, because of all the things we've discussed, is so dependent on its energy capabilities, and its future so dependent on how its energy assets are treated and handled. And so I'm really looking forward to being someone in the Senate who could be a real leader, on these issues, a leader with intellectual honesty and clarity, someone who is able to talk in a very thoughtful and effective way about the fact that there really need not be trade-offs between economic growth and development and preserving and conserving our environment. And I'm excited about bringing that leadership to Pennsylvania and that leadership to America. And I'm so glad that this podcast is focused on that very same question, and I'm happy to be on it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And just real quick, tell people where they could find you on social media, where they can find the campaign.
Yeah, you can find out more about me at davemccormickpa.com.
Thank you, sir, so much for being on.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you so much to Dave McCormick for coming on the show. As always, you can find us anywhere that you find any sort of podcast, Apple, Spotify, all those good places. Make sure to subscribe and then go give us a rating and tell us what you think. Until next time, take care.
And before we jump, the Coming Clean podcast is grateful to be powered by Ørsted, a wonderful company strengthening America's energy security with reliable and domestic clean energy. Through its integrated renewable energy solutions, Ørsted is creating American jobs, investing in American communities, and driving American innovation, all while preserving our country's natural habitats. A clean energy future truly connects us all, and Ørsted is helping lead the charge. To learn more, visit us.orsted.com.